And we're live with our 233rd episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on most social media platforms, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law, also on most social media platforms. Seth, say hi.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. A lot's happened in the last week. Ken and I are excited to be back as always. Have been talking through a number of different things that have happened. Before we launch into too much, though, I do want to give a shout out to Redpoint, our sponsor, Redpoint Security. They specialize in code security for coders, bolstered by years of experience testing applications and conducting code reviews against all types of applications, including web, mobile, AI, and Web3. Redpoint also offers training to help ground your team in better security practices across the development lifecycle. So check out redpointsecurity.com for more information. Along those lines,
I'll,
too, right? Yeah, go
I
for
can
it.
give my blurb too, but I don't have it written down and cool like you,
Come
because we
on, man.
also
That's what
we do.
ChatGPT is for. Let's be honest.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah.
Actually, you're not wrong. Um, So, Dry Run Security, company I co-founded. I don't know what I don't have, like I said, a good blurb, but I'll say this: we surface risk in PRs and pull requests and code that's changing. We're primarily supporting GitHub as of right now, and we do that performing contextual security analysis. So if we see multiple data points trigger, so like a sensitive function being touched, something like an authorization or authentication function, maybe a sensitive file, something that's pretty security impacting inside your web application. Also, maybe we surface some AppSec issues, right? Normal AppSec, OWASP top 10 type stuff. Multiple factors taken into account. And if all those things pop, we alert your team. Otherwise, we stay pretty much under the hood, giving some recommendations and awareness, but nothing to alert you on. So that's kind of what Dry Run does. And last thing I wanted to note, not about Dry Run, but actually about and we'll put a link in here for our happy hour, but Impart Security
Yes.
is helping to co-sponsor alongside Redpoint and Dry Run our happy hour at CactusCon. But I'll hand that over to you because I know you got some stuff to say about that.
Yes, that was going to be the first thing on my list of upcoming events. Ken and I will be in Phoenix or Mesa for CactusCon, and Absolute AppSec is doing an Appy Hour, I guess is what we're calling it, a happy hour on Friday. It's basically after the conference happy hour that's going on Friday afternoon. We'll be going back over to the hotel that's attached to the conference center there. And yes, Ken's dropping in the happy hour link into the different media platforms. If you're going to be in Phoenix, you don't even have to be going to CactusCon to come to the happy hour if you would like to. But if you're going to be at CactusCon, definitely sign up. Come on over. We're going to have some Crocs and Socks swag. Oh, speaking of which, I got to grab something to show you.
Oh, cool! Because I haven't seen these.
No. This is yeah. We don't have the giblets yet, but I did have to show you these. I will be wearing Crocs and Socks. These are actually handmade wool socks from my wife, of all things. So,
nice.
Or hand cool. She's got some. So we need some sizes, Ken, so we can get you a pair of custom ones. We're actually going to have some socks to give away and maybe some Crocs as well for the happy hour. Just people that are going to be there. We're going to share some stuff out and have security discussions. Obviously, that's the whole idea, is bolster community. So excited to be there, CactusCon, and to run the happy hour. After that, we'll be at the next event will be KernelCon. We will be teaching practical secure code review at KernelCon with new LLM/AI bits included, how we're starting to utilize that in our practice, and how you can utilize it in your secure code review practice. CactusCon is a great place to actually get that. Given that it is a local conference, the cost is actually less than most of the other conferences that we're attached to. So give it a look. Other than that, right, there's more opportunities coming this year. We will be in Europe at Paris for DEF CON trainings. That one is, I believe that's a 4-day, if I remember right, Ken. That's a 4-day training that will be longer, more in depth, again with the new AI bits. I'm interested to see how that's going to go, or I'm excited to see how that one's going to go. That'll be in April. Yeah. So beginning of April is KernelCon. End of April will be Paris DEF CON trainings. I think those are the biggest things that are coming up on my radar right now. There are other conferences. There's other trainings that we're going to be doing. But yeah, just keep an eye out, right? We'd love to see people there at all the things, right?
Yes. We would love to
Yes.
see you all.
Yes.
You know what's funny? I don't even wear socks.
You
Like,
don't?
I don't. Well, I do if I have to, right? Like it, like a special occasion. But given most of the time, I'm like either at home or like doing jujitsu. Like it's freezing and sometimes it's freezing in the house just because we got these German shepherds, and I still refuse to wear socks. I call them feet prisons because I don't like socks and shoes. So like even right now, I mean, I'm wearing like I always wear flip flops. Like I don't know. Just can't do it. I don't know. But anyways, I'm not even sure why I brought that up. But just thinking about the socks you got, I'm like, just don't even wear them most of the time. Actually, I got asked about the Crocs and Socks thing by someone, fairly close, I guess. And I was like, well, at first I wasn't sure what they were asking, but I think what they're asking is like they didn't even understand what the background behind Crocs and Socks was, and so I had to explain it was kind of I looked at whenever you bring up things like auditing, boring stuff, and I say that tongue in cheek. It's obviously very necessary, but it's been very practical, which makes it very boring. And dad, kind of like a dad responsibility. And then it evolved into the Crocs and Socks of AppSec. But yeah, anyways, I forget that some people just haven't heard the reason behind that. So maybe now, if you didn't know that, that's now you know that.
Yeah, and I mean, we should probably do. I'll put together a quick post on it that we should drop on the website itself and on the blog as far as like what are the Crocs and Socks, like what are the basics of AppSec that we're talking about? Because I mean, it really did come out of the course, right? Like we were talking, through the basics of AAA, right? Authentication, authorization, and everyone always forgets auditing because it's the boring, right? It's the basics, the Crocs and Socks of the dad topics of security, right? That the auditors are going to come in and ask you about, right? And that's really what it comes down to. It's the basics of what you should have, what you should be doing from a security perspective. So yeah.
Now people
I mean,
know.
I think it was kind of funny too, because we were getting on the conversation, or we were getting on calls with Impart and some of their marketing people, right? And we're like, oh, Crocs and Socks. And they're like, what are you guys, what are you guys talking about? You're like, so weird.
Rightfully
like,
so.
Yeah. I'm like, yeah. Yeah. So we're a niche podcast, right? Like we talk about what we want to talk about.
We're not your average podcast. Yeah. No, like and their team's been awesome, Impart Security, their team's been awesome. Like I am yeah, it's very nice to have people like in the past. So just for everybody's awareness, in the past when we run like events, happy hours, namely, it's been kind of just like volunteer work that Seth and I did together. But in this case, now we've got some actual team of folks behind it. So it's kind of cool, like to watch. I mean, basically Seth and I were able to be pretty hands off on, getting the event planned, the event location planned and the food and the drinks and all that fun stuff. And, some input on, how things looked from a visual perspective and all that. But, yeah, it's just nice to have people to support you when you're really, really busy and you put one of these together. So, yeah, it's very cool. So thank you to Impart Security as well.
Yep. Thanks to them for sure. But yeah, we will have a giveaway, right? Like we'll be doing, I mean, we've got the socks and, stickers and things, but I think we're even going to have some Crocs that we're going to bring along to, do a raffle or whatever for, right? Like we'll figure it out. Right. And of course we've always got t-shirts and other stuff. Um, yeah,
Well,
I don't know.
speaking of conferences,
Speaking of conferences, yes, the big news this week is DEF CON was canceled and then uncanceled, right? I mean, that's always the joke that DEF CON is canceled because, we're trying to tell people not to come because there's way too many people there nowadays. But it actually, like, they got dropped by Caesars. And so they had to scramble, find another venue. They're going to be at the, Las Vegas Convention Center instead, same time frame. But here, let me drop that link in there because I mean, it's kind of an interesting discussion because I know there's a lot of speculation going on around why.
yeah,
Yeah.
Hacker News and Reddit had a lot of speculation. Like the Hacker News thread from this was pretty substantial. The one that actually seems like it practically makes the most sense is that or maybe makes sense is that they are now full swing back in motion since the Caesars is since the
Hmm.
pandemic isn't a thing and people are all back in Vegas getting rooms all year round versus just certain spots of the year. So it's more cost. Well, basically what they were saying is that gamblers, like specifically people that will spend money, are coming back during the time that DEF CON would traditionally be there for the reason that most people aren't there, which is August. So now, post pandemic world, they want the gamblers back taking up those rooms. It's more cost effective from their perspective. I don't know how I don't know the financials of all this, so I don't know at all if that's true. That's just some speculation. It seems like it kind of makes sense because they said a lot of hackers aren't necessarily a lot of the people attending anyways aren't necessarily big gamblers. I don't know. I don't. I've seen some folks at the gambling tables and whatnot, but I would say yeah, you were pretty much there for the conference. And I don't see. I think after hours you see a lot of people hanging out together. I don't see percentage wise ton of gamblers. So I mean that's the only reason I was like, oh, maybe that kind of makes sense. I mean, what do you think? I mean, we've heard the obvious ones too, where like people are at the bomb scare and all that from last year,
Yeah.
not wanting
I
that
mean,
again.
always the big speculation is, oh, well, they've always had the hackers there. And so they've like, screwed shit up. Right. Like, and I'm like, yeah, but not really. Right. Like most of the community nowadays is pretty respectful. I know who was it? Was it Jerry that was dropped into the Slack and was talking about like, the financials of Caesars Entertainment. Right. Like, um, right. Yeah. I imagine it has more to do with a business decision on Caesar's part than anything else. I can't imagine. I'm with you. I can't imagine that the crowd that goes to DEF CON that spends all their time at the convention center talking to each other, doing convention things, they don't spend as much time out on the floor gambling, and then it fills up their hotels and the spaces, right? Like I've always felt bad for the people that they're at the link on their vacation to gamble and all of a sudden like they've been
Mhm.
descended on by the DEF CON, right? Like it's just it would be a weird experience, right? Like so like I imagine that has a lot to do with it. And I'll be honest, right? Like even getting over to that new Caesars forum, like DEF CON outgrew that very quickly, right? Like we still had stuff that was going on in Flamingo, in like other locations, um, at Caesars hotels, and it's hard to run a conference when it is so disparate. I'll tell you, like from a hacker tracker perspective, like the number of events, like the number of mini conferences that are running inside and under the DEF CON umbrella is insane, right? Most conferences that we support, right? Like we got 2, 3 tracks, maybe 4, right? Tracks plus a couple other workshops and other events that are going on. and it's very easy to import the data. Like when we start looking at DEF CON and we've got 10 different villages plus the main tracks plus of all the night events plus everything else that's going into it, the maps that are involved, trying to get people from location A to location B, it gets so complex, right? And that's been the big discussion point now, is how do we do this with a space that we've never seen before or used before? Right? Like we had Paris Bally's back in the day. We kind of figured out what the transition was, how to move people back and forth between there. Now we're going to be at the Las Vegas Convention Center. What is that going to look like? How do we get people in and out? How do we direct them once they're in the space? Because the convention center is larger than the Caesars Forum was, right? But it's not as fixed walls either, right? Like the configuration is going to be up to DEF CON. And so navigating that and actually setting it up so that people can get from one track to another or into a village and see what they want to see, because that's continually the problem with DEF CON, and the complaints that we get from attendees is that they can't actually get into events. And you and I have both been there, right? Waiting in line for a talk, try and go see who, like, I don't know, back in the day, Dan Kaminsky speak. Good luck, right? Like you have to wait for 2 hours to get in and even just get a seat. And, they do some things to alleviate that, stream it online, stream it through the conference hotels. But I think people are going to need to give the organizers a little bit of grace this year as we figure out what the new reality looks like. Yeah. I kind of wandered all over the place there, Ken. So, yeah.
No, I do have a clarifying question though. You mentioned fixed walls. They're not being fixed walls. Are you literally talking about the movable sectional dividers that you use to divide off the rooms? Is that what you meant? Okay.
Yeah. And so the convention centers, generally it's a huge empty space, right? And then you decide how you want to divide it up, how many people you want per room, like what the different rooms look like. It sounds like there's a couple floors of the convention center. The upper floors are like fixed, like room sizes, but the lower floor, what you would think of traditionally as a convention floor, is basically a blank slate, and you have to choose what it's going to be. So dividing that up is going to be interesting. It'll be great for things like, the opening and closing ceremonies, the larger talks, because they can't expand it. But it's a lot of moving pieces. That's all.
Yes. One thing I'd throw out there for everybody is just make sure you book your, actually wait 2 hours and then book your travel. No, I'm kidding. Book your
good luck
hotel
already.
room. Yeah, right. But I'd say go book your hotel room now, because like if you don't, you'll be stuck far away from the happenings, and that's not fun. So yeah, just a reminder to everybody. Hey, I also was going to throw out there that, Seth, that I actually when we were planning our happy hour, we didn't want to, for Cactus Con, we didn't want to coincide with Cactus Con's happy hour. We wanted to be after. So what was cool is I couldn't find when their happy hour was happening on the website, on their website. But what I did do was I pulled up, when the marketing folks asked, I pulled up Hacker Tracker. I changed to Cactus Con, and then I was able to find the happy hour. So I didn't even tell you that, but that was actually how I figured out.
Yeah.
That was awesome. Yeah. And maybe it's more obvious to the website, but busy trying to skim as fast as possible. Anyways, Hacker Tracker didn't fail me. So yeah, man, nice job. That's awesome.
Glad to hear it. I'll give a shout out to Drew on that, because he's the one that loads all the data nowadays.
Okay. Thank you, Drew. Not Seth.
Yes.
Screw Seth.
Screw Seth. I just provide a platform.
But Drew.
Yeah. But Drew's awesome.
Drew's the one. I'll get Drew on the podcast now.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
We should. Drew. Drew's awesome. Yeah. So DEF CON moving. I mean, you're going to hear a lot about it, but plan ahead this year if you are going to go. Just realistically, what it's going to be, because it's going to be different, right? And we've moved locations multiple times, or DEF CON has moved locations multiple times. It's just it's always different, right? But if you're going to be out there, We will be doing training. Trainings will be at Sahara, however, right? The couple of days after the conference, as usual. So if you're going to stay for training, I would recommend staying or getting, at least for those days, hotel at the Sahara. And Ken and I will be hanging out there as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So that's DEF
yeah.
CON. There's not a lot of controversy there from my, in my estimation, right? But
Yeah, I mean, where was it before? Tropicana and Riviera or something like that? Or no, not Tropicana. Sorry. I thought
Link
Riviera or something.
Flamingo, the Riv
Yeah,
at one
Flamingo. That
point.
was what I was trying to figure out. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. The
Yeah. That
Riv
was what it
before it
was.
got torn down. Remember how gross that hotel was? Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, Adam said Riviera. Also, Adam had mentioned all the googly eyes and stickers. I'm sure that's super annoying. Though, it is a union job, and sometimes you see people just doing stuff just to do such stuff. Like it's not even. I've seen people on staff with union jobs in Vegas, literally just sweeping up nothing, just walking around, just like trying to find. So, I don't know. Not I'm saying make jobs for people by putting stickers on stuff, but at the same time, I've seen them do nothing, collecting a union job, and I'm all for it. I'm just saying, that is the reality. But yeah, the Riv was awful. That was so terrible. I mean, that was that was just a terrible hotel. Awful, very gross.
Yeah, and it was there for a few
Yeah.
years, right? Yeah.
This is actually, since Adam had mentioned the union job aspect. Yeah, it's actually crazy. Like Vegas, I don't know how many people know this, but with Vegas, like most of that is it's all unions, right? And the workers there, it's. I had a like either a Uber driver or a taxi driver one time break it all down because they were like deep into the union at one point, and then they were older. They were retired, and they were like, you wouldn't believe, um, how much is dependent on the union to keep things kind of flowing around
Well,
there.
yeah,
They're really the
especially
ones in
from
power.
especially with when it comes to the conferences, right? Like, a large conference comes in. I mean, if you've ever been to Black Hat and, got the lunch tickets for Black Hat, right? Like you sit down and all of the waiters, everybody, like everything associated with that, like that service is like union run, right? So like, yeah, Caesar's contracts with whoever it is, but they have to hire union workers. It's all just like this. Uh, it's interesting how it actually functions.
Yeah, because if we want like electrical
If you want to make
outlets or
changes, yeah.
electrical suppressors or whatever it might be, there's always like three people that have to be involved in that process, and it's
Mhm.
very funny to me, but it does keep people employed and not getting I don't know, whatever. I'm not getting into politics of that. I don't care, but just an interesting fact, I think, more so than anything, is that most of those jobs are almost all the jobs are union backed from my understanding.
Yeah.
Anyways, what we have like lots of stuff to cover in terms of technical bits. I
I
mean, we could
I
start
know.
with,
Do
I
you want to
mean,
talk about
which,
Doctorow's article? Yeah,
yeah, let's
I
dig into
found
that.
this fascinating because we do have so insecurity in general, we have this like propensity to be like, oh, it's never going to happen to me, right? Like, oh, I'm insecurity, so I'm never going to get hacked. I'm never going to get compromised. I'll never like fall for a phishing attempt, like whatever it is. Um, and I mean, honestly, like we had Cory was on, like he was on one of the conferences, right? That we did, like Midwinter Nights Con. He came on and gave a talk. He's super interesting. Don't necessarily agree with him on everything, but just like from a freedom perspective, from like pure like just thinking things through perspective, he's great to follow, right? Um, but this article that I just posted is him talking about how he actually got scammed, right? How he fell for a call, basically gave away his credit card information to the scammer, um, and ended up, it was like $8,000 of charges that hit his card. He had used a card at an ATM in a location as he was traveling. Thought that okay, right, like there's other things that are going on, and this is where it happens, right? Is usually when we're like engaged in other activities, right? Security becomes kind of a backdrop that we think about as opposed to something that's at the forefront of every decision that we make. And he was trying to make the right decisions, right? He had been called in the past for different purposes from his bank, and the call that he got, he thought was from the fraud detection team at the bank, but turned out to be the scammer themselves, right? And when you're frustrated, when you're in any of those situations, it's very easy to actually give away some of this information and not realize that you've done it until later. And that's exactly what happened to him. Yeah, I don't know. Like, what were your thoughts on it? Did you get a read through on this article?
I did. I think it's pretty much what you said. There were well, actually, the one that was really the one little detail that was interesting. He said, they asked normally with a card they'll ask for the last 4, but in this case they asked for the
Yeah.
last 7, and he totally forgot that the first 9 are predictable. They're just based off of, like, Visa has their own prefix, and even within a card organization like Visa or Amex or whatever it may be, there's like obviously sub prefixes based off of what type of partnership they have with some other group. Like a good example would be like Chase and United, for instance. They've got their organizations, Chase, United stuff. Anyways, it is kind of funny because he was like, well, first leisure suit, Larry said first 6 of Visa and MasterCard are the bank, right? Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
These are predictable prefixes. So in any case, they asked for the last 7 instead of the last 4. He thought, well, that's weird, but not, didn't think too much of it. That was kind of the big one that bit him.
Yep.
And they went through so they being the bank, they went through the logs, the fraud department did, and they're like, nobody ever called you from here. And that was kind of his revelation moment where he's like, oh, yeah, oops. And I also, by the way, funny title of the article, the Dunning-Kruger, what is it? Was something, cyber Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah.
That's funny, clever. Anyways, I could see that happening, being in a rush, and also because, like he had mentioned, that there were like a bunch of circumstances that occurred, but I mean, the whole taking the Max, whatever it is, the 737 off the fleets because of the bolt that was missing in the door of that one plane. I was actually caught, as you remember, I was caught up actually in between the weather and that going on. I was caught up in all that myself, so I understand how frustrating that day was when you were traveling on that day. So I mean, I get it. Yeah, I totally. I understand. I would say I have not contacted my bank back when I needed to because I was overly paranoid. So I don't know which one's worse. I mean, literally, like for 3 months, they're like, yeah, we're trying to get a hold of you. I was like, you guys seem like scammers. No. Like, no, legitimately, like we needed to get in contact with you. So, whoops. So anyways, you can be like me and be too paranoid about certain things. But anyways, I could see it happening. I'm glad he came out and said that it did. And I'm glad he shared that so that other people,
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we have a tendency not to give each other grace when it comes to that stuff too, right? Like, you're working on the security team, you're sending out like phishing exercises to, your staff. Of course, people are going to click on that link. Of course, like, you don't know everything else that's going on. And that's what he's speaking to here. And that's what I wanted to recognize is that, hey, we're all just people. We're all going to make mistakes. Right. And so like, yeah, he very, methodically goes through the blast radius and goes and works with the VP of this little credit union and like to see what actually happened. Most of us aren't going to go through that level of effort after having one of our cards actually, stolen or whatever it is and the charges in there. I mean, I think everyone's had that experience at this point, right? Like they've used their card somewhere, all of a sudden it's being used, and there's weird charges coming in. Um, you've got to know what the channels are that your bank is going to contact you from. But the interesting thing, right, like as well that he talks about is this idea of the Swiss cheese and the holes in security that exist, right? And when they happen to line up just right, the scammers find an avenue to actually exploit it and to commit fraud. And when they don't, then there is something that actually like prevents that from happening. So again, this goes back to Crocs and Socks, right? Like the basics of security for you personally, but also from a bank and from an app perspective. If we're doing everything that we need to, we're going to make sure that those holes don't actually line up, or, you know, when they do, we catch them quickly and we prevent what that blast radius is going to be. And that's one of the things, like personally, that, you know, like we should be thinking about both as developers, application security people, but as like in our daily lives is what happens when we do, you know, we do fall for the scam. What is it that you do, right? What is your incident response, right? Yeah.
Well, and I would add, although, like the simplest thing you can do, I mean, I think the people that are watching this podcast, unless you stumbled on this episode, you know this, but for everybody else who stumbles on this and listens, just call your bank directly.
Mm-hmm.
That's the
pull
best
out your card.
If anyone
call your bank.
Pull out your card, look at the number on it, call that number, talk to the bank. Don't talk to anybody else that solicits who calls you. I mean, again, maybe I'm not the best person to be giving advice since I went so long without. But in any case, no jokes aside, definitely just call that number.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, kind of bleeds into our next topic of, or not next topic, but it's related to the whole deep fake $25 million fraud.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you want to pivot.
Yeah,
I found that one to be super interesting because this is a new. So we'll post the article in here in a second, but what makes this a different? Yeah, $25 million is a lot of money. I will say, it's not that crazy, believe it or not. Like I won't give out. I can't tell you which company, and I can't tell you which person told me this, so people can believe me or not. But there is a company that my buddy worked for, and they do regularly 7-8 figure transfers because they have so many different partners that are receiving profit for what they do for the platform, that it's not uncommon to do a bunch of transfers. And so just through nothing more than emails, there was a lot of money stolen from this company a while back. And the CFO was the one who actually transferred it because it was pretty convincing, right? Well, if that can happen via that email, this is bananas, right? So like, yes, $25 million was stolen, but it was the way that it was done, where this wasn't just a simple email. They actually used deepfake AI technology to Zoom chat as high-level members of the organization with, oh gosh, was it the CFO or it was somebody up like that? I think it might have been the CFO, and convince them to perform this transfer. And everything seemed legit using deepfake AI technology. And that money was lost. So that's a new precedent. You know, I don't know if money's been stolen with deepfakes before. I mean, I would assume they probably didn't start with $25 million, but that's been, I mean, what are your thoughts on all this? Because I don't even know where to begin.
Yeah, it's been coming for a while, right? This is the sort of article that you expect to happen. This is where we start to talk about MFA, right? An actual like real two-factor authentication, and how do you validate that someone who is who they say they are? Because from a voice perspective, this would be pretty easy to do, right? Like, when you see it, like I would be interested to see like what it actually looked like from a deepfake perspective, right? Like, but I guess you think about a Zoom chat, you think about like this format that we're in right here, and actually like, everything's pretty fixed, right? It's not like, transposing someone else's face on top of mine is one thing. And we actually saw some of this at DEF CON, right? There was, DEF CON deep fake. Hold on. I'm going to find the article or the presentation on it. DEF CON 31. Yeah. Look Mime CEO, real-time video, and how to actually run it through. So let me post this because it's exactly what I believe they probably used, which is interesting. That like it was almost predicted this last year that something like this was going to happen, right? Like we have images, people post images on social media, on LinkedIn of themselves, of us here, right? Like it'd probably be pretty easy to deep fake either one of us with this technology because there's so many shots of us actually like recording video, like our faces, our features, giving that to an AI to predict what it would look like in a different situation, especially with a fixed background. I can totally see it happening, right? Like, and then trying to call bank or pretend to do something else. It's not surprising, I guess, is where it goes, where I go to is it's not surprising. And so that's where I spin towards how do we authenticate people in a situation like this, right? Like, we're going to have to start giving tokens out, right? Like Zoom is going to have to authenticate before allowing people to join to a secure communication channel, Signal, right? Like other ways that we actually validate people before we start communicating with them, because obviously this is it's becoming untrusted, right? Oh, they have to sign in first. They have to do something else to prove identity before you're actually start to have that conversation. But, I don't know. It's so difficult to push that. Yeah.
Say the keyword that you've mutually exchanged on the video.
Exactly.
Or the phrase, the lazy dog jumps over the log or whatever. I can't remember what it used to be or what it is. But yeah, something like that. It's your little cipher key. But
you have to establish that, right? Like you're starting to talk about key exchange in verbal format, right? Like that's bizarre, right?
It is, but is it wildly a terrible idea for if you're the social engineering physical security person and you're asked how can we in the short term spending no money maybe make sure that doesn't happen? I don't know. I mean, if you exchange that, well, I mean, we don't have to get into it, but yeah, I mean, well, because then what would you do? Exchange that via email? I mean, that's the crux of the issue, right?
Well, yeah, no, okay. So yeah, that's just it. Like you have to prove identity first, right? Like through some other mechanism. And then you have to generate a phrase somehow, right? So I put a word into something that I send to you that you put into your generator, and then you have to spit that word back out, right? Like, so for that secret phrase to happen,
Dry Run's going to pivot. We're going to be duo for Zoom for video chat.
In-person duo.
Exactly. Oh, man.
Live MFA. But you can see that.
We're going to go back to facsimile first. That's how we're going to exchange, because nobody's got facsimile.
Well, and
we'll just take an esoteric technology to exchange keys, and that'll be how we solve it through obfuscation. I don't know. Yeah. Just making shit up.
But I'm wondering, from a biometric perspective too, how AI and how generative models are going, how you're going to protect against something like deep fake, right? I imagine it's going to be difficult to replicate someone's image, someone's face, but can you trick something like Face ID? Can you trick something like a fingerprint reader, using generative AI? I don't know, right? At some point it's going to have to be you authenticate through a trusted mechanism, and then you have to generate a token, you have to say a token, or you have some sort of system set up, whether that is a signal or something else that actually does that authentication to prove that, hey, I am actually doing the podcast with Ken today, and not some generative deep fake of Ken and somebody else that's got an agenda, right? Like it's rather fascinating to think about, right? Like, the implications of what are going to happen here.
Gonna be a fascinating new world. But I have an idea for our April 1st episode.
We'll see what we could figure out there. That could be fun, right?
It could be very fun. Oh man, I feel loopy today. I'm exhausted. But not exhausted. I just didn't sleep a lot last night, so I'm feeling goofy today. So sorry to those listening if just sound sillier than normal. Doing our best here. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. Like this, yeah, new era of fraud, new era of disinformation, misinformation, more so disinformation. Yeah, it's kind
It
of
is. It
wild.
is.
It is
It's
interesting to
just
think about how to prevent these things. And I think the thing that you see a lot is like AI is not good at detecting AI, and you hear that all the time. So it's not like we have any magical solutions that yeah, he might come back to the old school stuff, just re-implement it for
no,
a new format and
it
new
is.
issue.
It's gonna be Crocs and Socks. It's identity and authorization. It's authentication, authorization, and auditing. As much as
Yeah,
we crack jokes about it, that it all falls back to that. And that's, I don't know, that recent talk that I've been giving of like modern versus old school, and I actually went and reviewed like the old Ware report from the late 1960s, that talks about possible security issues that are going to pop up for network systems, and all of this feeds directly into that, right? Like the basics of, hey, how do we protect against identity issues or authorization issues or fraud issues? It all comes back to those things. So yeah.
sure does. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, there's some good research to be done there, right? Like, go. I was actually in that talk for the text to speech deep fake, right? It was an interesting one. So the fact that it's happening, I guess I think that's why it doesn't surprise me too much to deep fake a CFO that's publicly known, using that to convince lower level employees to actually like transfer money. It's just an extension of, hey, I want your CEO wants you to go buy Apple Pay cards or whatever, right? Like, yeah, yes,
Yeah.
it's an
Wow.
extension on that, but just it's larger scale, right? Yeah. Yep.
I was going
Cool.
to talk about Spoutible,
Okay.
more so the breakdown. All right, so
You want to?
I put this article in. Sorry, so Troy Hunt did a breakdown of their API, of Spoutable's API. Which, let's just talk for a sec about what Spoutible is. The whole idea is, in their own words, you can spout off stuff without effectively any ramifications, right? So you can say what you want to say and not be a target of harassment, threats of violence. I'm reading this out loud. Sorry. Racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, just a lot of stuff. That's all the phobias and the isms and just protecting you from that. But this is where that kind of becomes an issue, right? So Spoutible had a problem with their API, and just before I go any further, I'll say at the very end of the article, the timeline was pretty quick. Troy had said that wasn't able to find a security.txt file, so just reached out to basically the founder and got a response within, I think, and things mitigated within like 4 hours. So, just going to put that out there first before we go into like the incredibly bad design that they put into place, because I'm not going to be nice about that. I'll be nice about the reaction. I won't be nice about how they designed a platform designed to protect your identity. Anyways, all right. So basic breakdown. There were actually 2 API endpoints doing this, but this is the first sort of thing that was odd, right? So when you pull an API endpoint with it takes a parameter, a username, it gives you back some of the things you would expect, obvious stuff, right? Maybe your name and like your about, the things you would all expect from a social media profile. But also it returned many, yeah, thank you for sharing, because it's better to just visually see it. So, right, that's the one that's normal, right? Username, first name, last name, and the about status. The ID, I don't know, that's opinionated. Sometimes you need the ID because you're going to have like a RESTful API where you have to pass in user's ID and stuff like that. So it's not, I wouldn't say that's any kind of big deal. But this is where it gets a little weird. He's like, all right, well, email, that's put in there. IP address, obviously bad. Verified phone, obviously bad. And so now we have some PII, right? Email, IP, verified phone, and gender. So some for PII. Can you scroll down a little bit more? And so he's like, well, that seems really obviously pretty awful. Okay, cool. So now he continues to see what else he can scrape from this data. So he was able to get the password in bcrypt hash form, right? So, okay, now we're getting some information that's pretty valuable. Bcrypt is a pretty solid protocol, but hey, you can put in, if you're allowed to enter in insecure passwords when you set your password, such as using the name Spoutible or password 123 or whatever, then
Yeah.
Bcrypt becomes a lot less effective. He's points to some of the articles he's written and others have written and whatnot around that. So then we go a little bit further, because now the problem is, even if you figure out the password, well, they might have two-factor auth enabled. But thankfully, or not thankfully, the API returns the seed for the two-factor auth generation, the algorithm. So he threw it over to Stefan, who's on his team, and Stefan and others from Twitter within, I think the fastest was within like 3 minutes or something, had generated TOTP codes that were accurate for Troy's account using that seed. So now we've broken a password hash, grabbed the TOTP seed generator. So now we can generate TOTP. So we basically, you can break into most accounts or accounts that you have the ability to crack the password on. All right. But then it gets even more interesting, right? Now there's an EM code, EM_code. What is that for? Well, this one's used as your as in your individual reset code for resetting your password. So all you have to do is go into to the relevant endpoint for the password reset, put in the EM code of the user you just downloaded, and boom, you can reset their password. Right. So no password cracking even needed. Things don't get much better from there. I mean, he found the same thing on another endpoint. I just want to say, Seth, before I hand it over to you, because I know you're going to have some rants about this one. This feels like a lot of the pen tests I did a long time ago. It does not feel like a lot of the pen tests I've done in recent years. And it does feel a lot like an OWASP vulnerable app.
So, yes, it does. Okay, now that being said,
off to the races with Seth.
That being said, I have seen similar things within the last year, both from just like a generic like API endpoint, like Troy's looking at here, especially sadly to say in the Web3 space, right? This is a common pattern that they follow. They dump the user object and don't realize that the user object has all of these different tokens associated with it, from 2FA to password to everything else, to even keys for wallets and like stuff like that. So private keys. Okay, so I've seen it there, but I've also seen it in GraphQL implementations over the last, being able to ask GraphQL, hey, for this user, tell me these things, and authorizations don't limit that from happening. So it's kind of this dual pronged thing that we're seeing, that developers are disconnected between front end and back end developers, and the front end needs certain information. They retrieve it from the back end. The back end is like, oh, well, we're just, putting together this like user. We're going to send you the user object, and the front end developers just pick out the pieces that they need and make the changes as necessary. And then I would even go further than this. Like some of the other things that probably aren't as bad as this, but are still pretty bad, are the ability to actually make changes to those user objects based on post requests with things like the ID parameter or the ID that you can retrieve back out. Like that's more insecure direct object reference, but it all goes to like sensitive data disclosure, authorization issues around that when dealing with these APIs that are exposed. And I think a lot of it just comes from the speed of development of these platforms. They're trying to push things out very quickly. They don't necessarily think about the risks that are associated with what they're dealing with, and it gets exposed. So it's bad for sure. I think there was a lull there. You're right, Ken. Like we saw this sorts of data exposure, like within like even HTML pages and hidden form field parameters, 10, 15 years ago. But there's been a resurgence when it comes to the sensitive data disclosure for these different API endpoints, especially during the early days of those endpoints actually existing. Now I don't know a lot about what is this Spoutible, whatever it is, like how long it's actually existed and been in circulation. That would be interesting to me to see how much of this is actually like how long it's been vulnerable, because usually this stuff pops up pretty quick, and usually somebody discovers it, especially in the Web3 space where there's so much money involved. Like you expose a secret key to actually allow money transfer, and man, that gets exploited the second that it pops up, right? Like it happens so quickly. Because there is money involved, and maybe that's why. I don't know, but yeah, I'd be interested to see how long it's actually existed.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I don't know. Sometimes these things last for a long time, and it just somebody happens to stumble upon it. And I don't know. It's just like, man, if your whole thing's to protect users from fear of harassment, like you gotta get privacy right. Okay, you gotta get privacy right. So, um, what I mean, it's funny though, because like you say you've seen this recently, and it does make sense now. Because like I didn't think about it, but yeah, with GraphQL specifically, because I remember,
hmm
yeah, some instances where I'd seen apps where GraphQL, like we have seen apps where GraphQL, just the authorization, almost like it was. Well, it tends to be pretty custom per application, and it doesn't seem like with authorization in GraphQL, I've seen a lot of like standardization amongst how it's done. So it does make sense that there be flaws there. Also, REST APIs are notorious for having those kinds of flaws as well. I wonder though if it isn't also how some of these frameworks that have come out have made things so convenient to a fault where you're able to return like basically a user object and all the attributes, whether it's through associations or it's all in that one table or model, um, basically serializing all those attributes that are associated with that user object, and then just sending it back and allowing the
hmm
front end to parse out the elements it wants. And
Yep.
so part of me could see them just being like implementing that way, and then not maybe if there's like a obscure part of the documentation or no part of the documentation, but more likely an obscure part of the documentation that says here's how you, I don't know, deny list or allow list, certain attributes that wasn't probably
Exclusions.
implemented.
Yep.
Yeah, it's probably convenient to
I
just return the
well, and
whole
that was it
thing.
because like
But who knows?
Rails and Django, right? Like they kind of have that built into them now, right? Like to suppress some of that as it's sending back and forth. Um, but the second that we overlay that with GraphQL middleware, right, that's actually exposing that data, making it easy to interact with it, it's very easy to see where again that security hole lines up, right? Where you can be like, oh, well, I've got the protections in place, but it's only when I'm using the Rails endpoints and interacting with the model there, as opposed to the GraphQL middleware, which is, an easy way for me to expose a GraphQL endpoint, also accessing the same models and the same data underneath the hood. And then you turn on like the introspection query, and you can go in and look at the user model, and it's just modeling out whatever's in the code itself, and it'll tell you that it's available, right? And that's the shocking thing, is you'll see that, as it steps through, you'll see it in the introspection as well as like in the data itself that's being returned.
Yeah, and there's a lot of new like JavaScript and other language web frameworks that came out too that make things, their whole thing is to make things as quick and easy as possible to get going, which makes sense, but like they lack some level of, I don't know, anytime you abstract away a lot of things, you end up with not a lot of control, right? Usability, but not a lot of control. And certainly not awareness on how the underpinning things work. So there, that, and as we've said and shown and demonstrated a million times, these frameworks don't seem to learn from each other. Like anytime I see a dev build a framework and it even implements even like half of the things that we've learned that you need to implement in a framework, I'm like, that's pretty good, because most people are just like, you know what? Nobody else has done this right. I got it. Let me do this.
Yeah.
Also, I'll do no prior research on what went wrong from a security perspective. So then we're left with that. And by the way, tomorrow you got to support it because your engineers adopted it. So
what is it that we said about rolling our own crypto, right? Like, years ago, that first project that we were on, where we found that crypto library they were passing around, that the key really was just the date and hour. Yeah, it was amazing, right?
Yeah, that's right. Oh, that's crypto. Or how about the Rot 13 one? That was my favorite crypto I've ever seen in my life. That was awesome. That was that Filio, David Filio, who found that
I think
one, or was
so.
that someone else?
I think it
Yeah, it was
was.
hilarious.
Yeah, that's always.
I don't know if we've told on the podcast. I know we've talked about it in the course, but I'll just mention it again for those who've never heard the story. Seth and I were working at Fishnet, and one of our friends / consultants threw a question out to folks. Was like, the last 3 characters in this, because basically you go to this URL and it's got this at the end, and the parameters got like the value in the parameters got like this seemingly random value, except for the 3. It's like period, and then 3 characters that obviously never change. So you can guess that there's some file extension there. And so when you rotate it 13 places in the alphabet, Rot 13, the oldest, dumbest cipher ever, right? It was PDF. So now we're like, oh, this is a PDF file names, and it's got like sensitive content out the yin yang, right? And then someone wrote like a little JavaScript Rot 13 thing and generated all the file names and just downloaded them, downloaded files without necessary access that should have been required. And anyways, really funny story, because it's wild when you see stuff like that in real life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like what Troy's putting in here. Like when you see this in real life, when you see it in an assessment or in a code review, right? Like it's like, wow, how did this ever like make it through? And then you also have to take a step back, right? Like, because there's people that are actually building this software, and give them a little bit of at least like grace that there was other things, like with Cory, right? Like there was other things going on when they built it, and they may not have been aware that it was being exposed, or it was intended to be an internal API where you need to retrieve that data back and forth, right? Like, and it just got exposed because of a mistake or miscommunication, whatever it is, right? Like we don't know what actually went on. So pointing fingers and being super like judgmental about it is not helpful to the situation. And I think that's what I've learned, at least like dealing with developers over time, is like no one is intending to do any of this, right? It's usually it's always a mistake. It's always some sort of miscommunication. It's always business pressure. Like there's other factors that lead into why these exploits exist. And it's usually not a knock on the developer's experience or the developer's, know-how. It's usually just like a lack of awareness when it comes down to it.
Pretty much.
But it's all, they're pretty fun stories when you You think about ROT 13, you think about the use yeah. I mean, base 64 is always fun too, because that's always been used as base 64 encryption, right? Like, for years and years, we'd hear that. But nowadays, right, like it's almost second nature when I see like EY at the beginning of a string, you're like, oh, that's a jot, right? Like it is, right? Like, cause that's the curly
Or a
brace.
JWT.
Yeah. JWT. It's a JSON web token, right? Yes. Whatever, right? Like, yeah.
What was funny too in his article was he talked about, because it was like the same scenario that we both ran into before, where he said, because I've had that conversation. Oh my God, it was the worst was when I was working for the Pentagon and contract, like basically doing AppSec assessments for all the all the companies that have contracts that build websites for the different branches that are connected to the Pentagon. Basically, if you put a website online at the Pentagon, it needs to, on that infrastructure in any way, it's got to go through an assessment, which is a whole other set of stories for a different time. But one of the ones I would come across, because this is pretty early days of using an intercepting proxy. So Troy had mentioned that, he told some developers like that he could do the same kind of thing that he's talking about in the article with Fiddler. And they were like, well, don't worry about it. Okay. None of our users use Fiddler. And I remember having the same exact conversation with these folks.
Who would use
I was
that?
like, well, because it was so early days of AppSec for one. And, two, proxies were pretty new, but three, and this is the not nicest one to say, but it is the reality. So you can take it for what it's worth. These are companies trying to undercut and outbid every other company. Do you think they're hiring the best developers in the world? I'm sorry if I offend anybody with this, but the answer is usually not. No, they're not. So unfortunately, there were a lot of those uncomfortable conversations where I sat in a room. I'm like, but you understand what we're saying, though, right? Do you really understand what I'm saying? Listen, take the proxy out of it. Go into your browser. Go into developer tools. We're going to do this together. It was so tough. I mean, thankfully, like that those days have been long behind me, but that's still, I'm sure, the case for a lot of people out there dealing with conversations like that. That's a tough one. So if you're dealing with conversations like that, there is help. You can come to absoluteappsec.com and visit your friends Seth and Ken.
Yeah, join our Slack channel. We will commiserate.
Join our Slack channel. We can help you feel better about your problems.
Yes,
you're not alone.
You are not alone.
Don't suffer in silence
together. Yes.
But it is tough, man. It is tough to have those conversations with folks who are just completely, I mean, because, especially when you're talking to basically people that have the equivalent experience of a junior developer, they're still struggling with some of the fundamentals of programming and making things work. And it's a non-trivial challenge to run something at scale, meet all the requirements and all that stuff. And then you throw in the security person who's like, I can do this. And they've never heard of these techniques. They've never heard of these vulnerabilities. They have no idea what a proxy is. I kind of get it, but at the same time, I was always like, this is just the worst. But it's good. It made me good at like explaining issues to people. So yeah, that's what it is.
Well, and that was it, right? Like initially when we were at Fishnet, most of like the first like quarter of our security training was not actually like security related. It was like, this is the basics of HTTP and how the web browser communicates with the server itself, because there were so many questions and so many developers that we ran into that did not realize this, like what the connection was, that you could actually intercept it. You could actually like see the communication as it went back and forth. It was a lot of like web 101, right? Like how does the web actually operate? Those early days of teaching like application security 101, that's what we did. Like I had modules on that we would have to review on, look at what you can actually see. This is what a proxy is. This is a plain text protocol. There's no secrets involved here. And if you're not using encrypted communications, anyone sitting on the network can see that as well, right? Like it was a revelation to a lot of those developers back then because they'd just never heard it before. It was a lack of training and a lack of awareness, in learning those basics, right? So if you are struggling with it, you want to teach your developers, let me know, right? Like Redpoint does offer training at that level, but
Here we go.
there's your pitch, right?
Here,
Yeah.
Mr. Sales. No, yeah. No, but yeah, like it is a that's one of the it's a how it's one of those things where yes, it's tough, but it is kind of like a formative shaping of your some soft skills. That does help with it did help with soft skills, I'll say that, to have those conversations. And it's not like these people are just I'm not trying to give the impression that they're idiots or anything. It's just that, like, you get what you get sometimes, and that was one of those situations. And but again, even if these were really experienced developers, a lot of the stuff they were talking about just was so new back then. I mean, I remember having conversations where they're like, yeah, but how would someone know how to format that SOAP request? And I'm like, you put a WSDL line. They're like, WSDL, explain more. Like,
Yeah.
you're the one that implemented SOAP. What are you talking? Well, that's not available to everybody? It absolutely is available to everybody. Well, how'd you find it? I just guessed. Like,
I put a
yeah, but
question
you're special. Like,
WSDL
no,
at the
I'm
end.
not. Exactly. No.
There's a
Wild
whole
ones.
there's a whole RFC on how that's supposed to operate it. I went and read the doc, and it told me, like, this is what I'm supposed to. I think the amount of vulnerabilities that I found reading the docs has been
Reading the
amazing,
docs.
right? Like reading the docs, right? Like going through and reading the framework documentation for Rails, right? Oh, like how do endpoints actually work? Oh, look, right? Like, oh, it mapped all this out for me. Look, I can just do this, and yeah, it's constantly surprising what how much people will just jump into things without having the background that they probably should in order to do it. But
Yeah,
anyway.
pretty true.
Anyway.
Well, at the same time, sometimes you just got to make stuff work. You got to ask to build stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and you just figure it out, just like hackers do when we're presented a new target. So
Yep.
we're all just figuring stuff out, I guess, together.
Yep. Sweet. Well, cool. We've been going for over an hour today. Yeah. Like Ken said, though, if you have questions, if you want to join the conversation, jump into Slack. There's been quite a bit of activity the last couple of weeks. A lot of good articles being posted. A lot of things that we talked about today actually popped up in Slack over the last week. But don't forget about the happy hour RSVP if you're going to be at CactusCon, and come see us. And yeah, I think that's everything for today, Ken, unless you got something else you want to bring up.
No.
Sweet.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you all online.